Hey team, before we dive into today's episode, I've got a quick favour to ask. The Women's Football Hub merch store is now live, and every purchase helps support our work as a non-profit championing women and girls football from the ground up. There's something for everybody, adults and kids. There's loads of colours and sizes, and your support helps us grow the game one piece of apparel at a time. Just head over to www.womensfootballhub.com to check it out. Thanks for backing the hub, and now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome to Women's Football Hub. I am your host for this episode. I am Carolyn Kent, and today we're going to be discussing acquired brain injury in football. And my guest today has completed his MA in Sociology and MRes in Sociology and Research Methods, and also completed his PhD research looking at how people experience acquired brain injury. And he's here today to talk to me about his injury time report, looking at how players experience acquired brain injury. Welcome to Women's Football Hub, Dr Paul Pearson.
Oh yeah, how you doing?
You know, it's very nice to go very Scottish on this podcast. I love that. I'm gonna be talking like I'm from Glasgow by the end of this, I can tell.
I know you need to get some subtitles on for me.
That's okay, because YouTube does that automatically, so it's totally fine. Now, let's chat to you kind of about your injury time report, which obviously looked at player experiences of acquired brain injury in football. Talk to me about it and how this project came about.
Yes, so the Injury Time campaign was a campaign that was launched by Michael Mara, MSP, with the support of the PFA in Scotland, the GMB Union. The aim of the campaign was to have football-related brain injuries recognised as an industrial injury, which it currently isn't in Scotland or the kind of wider UK. So this kind of campaign came off the back of the kind of emerging research that showed we had this increased risk of neurodegenerative disease. So research done by researchers at the University of Glasgow as part of the field study. So I came into the project off the back of my colleague Barry, who I did the research alongside, who'd worked with Michael Mara before, and he just kind of got in touch and said that they wanted to do a piece of research to kind of back up the brain. So I was really interested in the topic, and he got in touch with another colleague that I knew from time working in brain injury, Amy Van Smith, who's a research nurse. So a big shout out to my colleagues as well.
And what kind of motivated you personally to look at this? Because obviously your PhD was in this area, but was there something that motivated you?
I'd say kind of three main things. So first of all, just that absolute love of the game. I'm a big football fan. I grew up playing football every day badly. I must have the important point. And I just love watching football and the game in general. I think secondly, there's a kind of personal element. 14 years ago, I sustained quite a kind of serious and kind of life-changing brain injury myself. So that kind of gave me obviously quite a bit of insight into the kind of physical and cognitive impacts that can come with a brain injury, but also the barriers that people face in society following those types of injuries. Tied a bit to my third motivation, which was when I had the injury myself, I was doing an access course. After the injury, I returned to do that. I ended up doing my sociology undergrad, that got some funding for like my master's and my PhD. I had an obvious kind of keen interest in the subject, and as you know, these more and more research was coming out, and I'd say as well, particularly the testimonies of like players that had been affected and often their families as well. Really wanted to get involved and do a piece of research on it.
Nice. Now let's talk about your actual report. Let's first of all go into a few things about it. You obviously talk about acquired brain injury. What was that definition? What did that mean within this report?
In general terms, an acquired brain injury just refers to an injury to the brain that's been sustained following work. We use the term brain injury generally in the research to refer to any sort of concussion. We also cover like neurodegenerative disease, so conditions such as Alzheimer's. We just use this kind of catch-all term throughout the research. So that's settled on.
And you basically did semi-structured interviews with 9 players in total. There was 7 males, 2 females. Is that right?
Yeah, so we carried out 9 participants in total. So the criteria for the research was that the participants had played senior level football in Scotland. Amongst our participants, we had a range of careers stretching back to the early 1980s to up until the present day. So amongst the 9 participants, the 3 participants were still playing senior level football. when we carried out the research. And I should also note as well that one of the participants was also someone who'd had diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's disease that was linked to their career.
I read that. And you basically split your report into sort of three segments, didn't you? Awareness of acquired brain injury in football, support for those with acquired brain injury in football, and then, of course, mitigations and recommendations, which were really what came next. So, talk about the main findings then. What did you find with this report?
Yes, what we found in terms of awareness, participants showed kind of varied awareness of brain injuries in terms of the risks associated with football. So in terms of the understanding of that link, I would say the understanding was partial. What I would say is that it wasn't an abstract concept to the participants. So amongst the participants, I think almost every participant reported having sustained at least one instance of brain injury while playing. In some cases, there was multiple cases. These were injuries that began prior to their senior career, so instances of it happening and coming through the kind of the sort of youth banks. So in terms of awareness, it was a kind of mixed bag. We found that for the players that had been playing the game maybe in the 1980s and the 1990s, this level of awareness was, when they were actually playing the game, was much lower in comparison to the players who were playing more recently or still. There was more awareness and understanding of it. In terms of support, we would say that from the evidence of the players, the support was reported as being inadequate, both historically and currently. And in terms of the measures that were, the mitigations that we were talking about, they were reported as being improving, but there were still cases within the evidence of like historic and, I would say, current mishandling of brain injuries.
So we're going to go at this from the player's experience or the player voice, aren't we, of what they have experienced. So what kinds of challenges do footballers with brain injuries typically face, both on and off the pitch?
So thankfully, on the pitch, there's a lack of awareness and a pressure in some cases that we found to hide the symptoms that the players might experience. So, like generally speaking, players spoke about this internal pressure to play through the pain barrier at times to make yourself available for selection, that competitive kind of spirit that we know that players have. But there was that evidence of a lack of awareness amongst, in one case, coaching staff. So one of our participants spoke about a case fairly recently of going up for a header during a match, having a really bad clash of heads. He described it as one of those ones when the people in the crowd go, oh, one of those sort of injuries. Consequently, feeling dizzy, think he fell over. He thought about it in the report. When he came off the pitch, his manager said, don't say what happened because it means that person took COVID triggered and you won't be able to play. So that took the physio actually to step in, or the medical staff to step in and say, no, that's not on. But I think that there's that thing of it can potentially harm your career if you miss matches with any type of injury. I think there can be a financial impact. Players out for a few games, you could miss a win bonus. Also, like for a lot of players in Scotland and elsewhere, players are often on a 1-year contract, so that can impact on the possibility of a contract renewal, impact on potential transfer somewhere else. And I think as well that in terms of like off the pitch, there's also potential lost income if the player's part-time. So if you sustain a brain injury, a form of a brain injury, it can mean missing time at work as well. And then obviously there's those kind of potential long-term health impacts as well.
Were there any sort of particular stories from players in this report that really stood out to you? Because obviously the one that you mentioned earlier was somebody had actually been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's.
Yeah, so there's loads. I'd say like that case on the report, person is Craig, and Craig gave this like really strong, powerful, and remote interview in general, but in the report we use his experience as a bit of a case study, and he discussed the onset of his symptoms, the process of going and getting diagnosed, the support from his partner, and that was a really powerful, emotive kind of insight into what that's like to experience for people. There were some other stories, say every report I felt in the report was really powerful, but there was a couple other things that really stood out to me. Something that surprised me in the research that I probably hadn't thought about much before was this aspect of players sustaining brain injuries prior to kind of getting into senior level football. One of the participants discussed being knocked out for the first time playing football when they were 14, and how in a month or two they had another, they were knocked out again and again and come to hospital, and actually getting to the stage where the hospital staff were speaking to him separately from his parents because they weren't sure as to what the name, was, where did this actually come from.
Yeah.
And also there was another case from one of the participants from the women's game who discussed being away with the international team when they were 16, again having a clash of heads during a match that night, taken ill, vomiting during the night, feeling dizzy. The next morning not being able to follow the team meeting, and then when they discussed it with the doctor, it was passed off as like food poisoning. So I think that for me, those examples really highlight that, this is something that not that I wasn't aware of it, but I never really thought about the fact that perhaps players are coming to the kind of senior game actually with already this kind of some cases team history about sustaining brain injuries as part of the game.
Yeah, there's another story in there actually as well about a player that had sustained a sort of head knock, but actually what had actually happened is they had a fracture of their temple. And I was blown away by that because I'm actually doing a little bit of training at the moment for resetting my advanced pitch side management. And, all that training is now in there. All these things that you have to check for any professional that's going to be working at a specific level. That did hit home to me thinking, God, I could actually deal with one of these things heading back onto the sideline. So let's chat about maybe the wider impact, right? How do these brain injuries impact not only on the player's career, but obviously afterwards when they're kind of finished and their family life and kind of future well-being?
I think in terms of just well-being, we know that it goes to the head, can lead to these serious neurodegenerative diseases and symptoms. But what I would point out in terms of like family life is for players who are affected, similar to people generally in society who have similar illnesses, that the family will likely become like a primary source of support and care. I know like from kind of wider research in brain injury and on other health conditions, generally speaking, what happens is we don't really think about these diseases. We're not trained and care for people. So it ends up being this situation where this onus and this responsibility and falls onto the family. So there's that obvious kind of like potential impact there. I think that there was a quote in research as well, which I think kind of speaks to that kind of wider family life kind of aspect, where one of the players was talking about it being advised by a doctor to retire due to the number of brain injuries they'd had playing the game, and they were reflecting on it. They were still playing, the interview, and they were reflecting on the fact that when they were young, they had quite, I'd say, a really high level of awareness in terms of brain injuries. When they were younger or earlier on in their career, they considered retiring, but they wanted to keep going because they wanted to see how far can I take the career, where can I go with it. But now, as they were a bit older, the reason for staying in the game was a financial one. Because they spoke about, I've got a mortgage now, I'm earning decent money, and I'm staying in the game for that. And they mentioned in the report and in the interview, both their mum and the partner had said to them that they should retire. So I think there's that. But I think I mentioned before about work as well. I think that it could have that impact on people's ability to earn money like later on in the game. And it was something that was remarked in another interview, was a belief or an experience, kind of experience that one of the players had was talking to other players who felt they developed symptoms but weren't coming forward because they were still working in the game. When there was a fear that if someone was to say receive a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, that their ability to earn money perhaps as part of the hospitality staff on match day or media work might be compromised. So I think there's quite a lot of kind of possible impacts and considerations.
And how well do you think that football as a sport currently understands acquired brain injury?
I think the level of awareness has grown. So the players played further back, towards the 90s, spoke of examples of the magic sponge being used to treat a suspected brain injury, of smelling salts being used on the pitch to wake you up. So there's obviously been like a general kind of absence more widely in the game at that time. So there's obviously been like a big kind of step, being a step forward. Amongst the players who were playing more recently in the interviews, people spoke about, said that it was discussed amongst teammates and in dressing rooms, and there was examples of like the use of black humour, which again suggests that there's a kind of growing awareness. And I think that for those older players as well, like in almost all of the interviews, they were aware of like peers, former teammates who'd been diagnosed with a neurodegenerative disease, or in some cases had died as well. I think there was that awareness, but I think there's also concerning examples in the research. So one of the participants played at the top level in the women's game had discussed how a new coach had come in with these outdated tactics related to heading and training that they themselves seen as outdated and pointless. And I think there is still a lack of awareness within the game, or like a disregard of like it to be in. I think in some ways football mirrors the kind of wider societal understanding, which is quite limited, and people don't generally know much about these injuries, these types of injuries until it affects them, which is understandable. But I think the really important point about what makes football different is that it's also a place of employment, and that within the game there's a lot of resources. So I think that I'd say that the awareness has grown. I think there's still kind of a long way to go.
That's obviously the actual kind of game itself. Are there misconceptions among players and coaches and fans? I've definitely heard some shouts at football games that I've thought, are you serious? And there was obviously that infamous story about John Lambie, what he said to a player. I don't know if you can remember that one where the player came off with a head injury and basically the manager had said, just tell him he's Pelé then and put him back on. So that's probably the infamous Scottish story. And Scotland have been actually quite leading on this front especially with regards to concussion, of they have their guidelines. Certainly from a medical staff perspective, we are very well trained on that in Scotland. And obviously FIFA have released their guidelines as well. But is there misconceptions among players, coaches, fans?
I think the myth that the cases of neurodegenerative disease are down to the old heavy footballs still persists. So it's this idea that back in the day, the balls would fill up with water, makes them really heavy. I'm not explaining to you, you're more football than I do. It's just
Are you trying to say I'm old enough to head those, is it?
that would be maybe I headed it to you. But there's this perception that these balls would fill up with water and then they were heavy, and then that's what was causing it. We know now that balls they are much lighter, but they travel at the speeds, and players still header the ball repeatedly. So I think that gives a kind of false sense of security that this is an issue that's on the most part something replaced. I think there's also a kind of misconception that this is something that only affects old people. So I think it's been challenged increasingly with the increase in evidence and research in both football and other sports, but also really key down to players coming forward. So it was recently the case of Dean Windass, who shared his diagnosis, who's younger than maybe the profile that would have been the expected case before. And I think another misconception that I'd like to raise is that this belief that a diagnosis is the end, there's nothing comes after it. I saw an interview recently with Andy Payton, who I remember seeing playing for Celtic, who's received a diagnosis of dementia, and I thought linked his playing career. I think he actually said that he went and got a brain scan because he was friends with Dean Windass and he'd seen it, and that was the kind of motivation to get him to go and get his brain scanned. But I think Andy Payton in that interview was a great example of someone who's continuing to live his life. I think that's really important. But I think it's the terminology as well. I don't know if that comes under like a misconception, but I think that often in football we'll hear someone's had a bang to the head, or even the use of the term concussion, which I've probably been using already in this interview. But I think that if you call it a brain injury, that you'd see a different reaction to it, and it's something that one of the players marked on in the research as well. But I think also when we're talking about neurodegenerative disease, it's not just a football issue, it's a societal issue as well. So, there's work to be done
And
in wider society.
We were chatting before we came on, and I was saying to you, we were talking about education and awareness, and you can educate and you can raise awareness, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you get change. And do you think that there's a role for education and awareness, behaviour change to protect these players?
I do. I do. I think there's a really significant role. I think that football should be looking to aim to make sure that everybody connected to the game, certainly in professional football, but elsewhere as well, has at least this basic awareness of the risks associated with the protocols about why people are actually looking to have changes made in football. Because I think that would hopefully lead to greater compliance with the kind of safety measures, because we can have protocols in place, we can share research, all that kind of thing, but people don't follow it, then it's not obviously not very useful. But I think part of that is helping to understand why it's the case. I was just going to say as well that you begin to build this awareness and carry out education, then it would hopefully mean that there'd be greater reception in the future of any new measures as well. And I think it would also potentially help support players to possibly come forward earlier to seek treatment or support or a diagnosis if this was less of a better understood and less of a taboo subject. But I think it's really key that these campaigns have to be tailored. So if I write some big long report, the one long report is assiduous, but that's not accessible. If you write an academic journal, that's not accessible to most people. And I think that the players discussed the importance of the role of ex-players when it comes to awareness raising. So possibly having individual reps at clubs as well, but crucially making sure that research that does exist is conveyed to players in a way that they that's accessible, that they understand it, and also coming from someone who they know and respect. So if that was an ex-player, they were possibly more likely to listen. And I think that also, we spoke about in the research about the methods that you could use to carry out an awareness campaign or an education campaign. And it's just things that you would expect generally. Don't just send out emails, people open up phones, messages or whatever. Do it in ways that, depending on who it is that you're wanting to target, do it in ways that people uses, forms of communication that people use. So for some of the older players, they talk about being in WhatsApp groups, the retired players using it for keeping in touch, but also sharing info, that kind of thing. But then maybe thinking about if you're wanting to reach a younger audience, Snapchat, TikTok, YouTube, don't know I'm not very young anymore, unfortunately, but if you want to speak to young people, then use the methods of communication that they're using. And then also just one more point on that, in the interviews with one of the participants from the women's game, she spoke about if you have a campaign where, say, for talking's sake, it's a 70-year-old man who has a diagnosis of the Alzheimer's disease, then a young player from a women's game isn't necessarily going to recognise themselves in that. So just being really, if you are going to try and carry out education and awareness raising, being really mindful of who it is you're trying to reach and adapting your methods.
Yeah. And obviously support systems, from the research that you did and the testimonies, what kind of support did the footballers feel was missing for them?
I think a central, reliable place to go for information and support. So I'd say that within this, that would include medical access to medical support, but also financial support as well, if it was required. I think an example, the participant that we refer to as Greg, so the person that had the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, we spoke to him about what support were you able to access, what support was offered out to you. And I think the one example, and I'm aware that I'm speaking about one person's experience here, but he said that one form of support that he'd had was an invite by one of his former clubs to come along for kind of match day experience, which he appreciated. But he spoke about pretty much an absence of support. But I think also wider support also for injuries. So 3 of the participants in the research had career-ending injuries due to various, maybe perhaps more traditional injuries that footballers face. And there was one of the cases, one of the participants who we referred to as Grant, in the research spoke about being in a position where he needed a form of surgery, and the club said, we'll pay for it if it works, but you have to pay for done. So I think he played on for a bit, but ended up retiring. And then he spoke about that impact of being retiring when he was relatively young and how hard it was, knowing that he still kind of had more to give. But I think that support for injured players generally was something that came through really strongly. There was other examples of talking about and players in lower leagues having to organise fundraisers for players who'd been injured, because obviously, again, if you're part-time and you have a job somewhere else, you sustain a serious injury, then that might mean that you're not able to go to your other form of employment. And I think that what I found quite interesting, or what that really made me think of when I was doing the interviews and analysing the data, was that if that's the infrastructure that's available for players with injuries that we perhaps understand better, we're more familiar with, then what does that mean for a player who has a brain injury? And it perhaps led to one other thought as well, of you're talking about players who've maybe been told that you should consider retirement. Then what's available for that player to go and to take that decision? What is the financial support that's available? What's the access to possibly education or employment training? So I think that whole infrastructure in terms of support for players who are injured is really important, something that came through very strongly from, I'd say, almost all of the interviews.
Yeah, yeah. That's not something I haven't heard before, actually, to be fair, with regards to injury as well. Talking about the future, if you could see one immediate change in the way football handles brain injuries, what would it be?
I think the establishment of that comprehensive support, so I think it would be really good to see it come through a bill such as the Industrial Injuries Bill that Mike Mara was proposing in the Scottish Parliament, or there's currently an amendment in the All Football Governance Act for industrial injury support and that kind of wider care and support to be brought in. So I think that's a really key thing that I think is really important to see. Just kind of add on to that as well, like just a bit of a change in terminology. I think it'd be really one really straightforward, simple change that we could see that can maybe raise awareness just to everybody that's kind of part of football, be it fans or players alike.
And what advice would you give to young players and their families about protecting brain health?
I think it's really, in terms of the younger players, I think it's really difficult. I could sit here and say, consider this, read up on that. I know how I was when I was a young player. You're just really keen to play. I think I've noticed recently, like one of my nephews has just went into the age range when he started heading the ball, and he started talking about having headaches after the game from he thinks from heading the ball. And it's very difficult to say to a young player, like, don't do that, take more time out, like the kind of advice that you would maybe give to somebody that was a bit older. So I think that young players need to be supported by those around them. So coaching staff need to have the measures in place so that they aren't the ones who have to maybe turn around and say, I don't feel okay to play, particularly when they perhaps look okay. I think in terms of families, what I would say is, if you have one of your children is signing up to play football, have a word with the coaches. It's something that, it's something that you're concerned about. Speak to the coaches and just say, what are the protocols? What's your approach to it? He's got any experience in the past of the player having been injured, and just kind of gauge it from that. I think that there's some things available. Like I noticed that Sports Scotland have a free e-course module just covering the basics of concussion generally that people could take. But I think that I'd say the overall kind of most important thing that I would say is that if you ever, for both like families, children, anybody involved in football or even generally in public, if you ever think you've had a blow to the head, you don't feel well, you think something might be up, just go to the hospital, seek medical attention. And I think that it's really important that the onus is put on the kind of structures of football in terms of this kind of thing rather than the individuals themselves. But I go to the, if you ever feel that you're ill or there might be something going on, go and get checked.
I think it's definitely sensible advice. Now, I would love to talk to you for longer, but I appreciate that you are a very busy man and you will have things to do with your evening. For listeners who want to support or learn more, or perhaps even read your injury time report, where can they get in contact?
The report's available on www.injury-time.com. If you just even Google injury time report, it should come up there. I'd say that also feel free, anyone that's interested in the subject, anybody that's carrying out research or anything like that at all, feel free to kind of get in touch with me on LinkedIn or through my research email as well, which is p.pearson.research@gmail.com.
Perfect. I can't thank you enough for coming along. I'm sure our paths will cross again in the future. You are literally very close to where I live at the moment. If you have been listening to this and you have any kind of questions, or you are looking towards playing football, or you've got any concerns, just remember as well there are protocols for most of the associations, so please check in with your local governing body. And if in doubt, please set them out, and we will see you soon.
Thank you for listening to Women's Football Hub. The information within this podcast is for informational purposes only. No material on this podcast is intended to be a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please contact your doctor or another healthcare professional if you have any questions about anything raised in this podcast.